You might have seen some of these recently. Videos of demolition of unfinished apartment blocks in China started circulating on the internet. Looks pretty odd, doesn't it? Well, in fact, if you haven't heard, China has been going through its worst economic state for the past 40 years. Apart from the total lockdown of the zero COVID policy, this is China in 2022. So what's up with the Chinese demolishing condo buildings all over the country right now? And what does it have to do with the country's economy? There are several major reasons for what's helped the Chinese economy to become the fastest ever growing economy on the planet to now being an economy in stagnation and protests all over the country, with the possibility of economic collapse. To start everything, we have to go back a few decades ago. Property in communist China is not private, i.e. it's owned by the government. After the reforms in property rights in the 80s, executed fully in 1988, the government of China gave the possibility to people to lease properties from the state for a period of 70 years. In China, it is deeply rooted into the culture that a person has to own a house, and the ones that do gain high respect among their peers. So buying a house is essential, especially if you're a man and you plan on making a family. This, together with the incentive of being able to own a home after times of no property rights, is huge aspiration for buying one. So in the 1990s, China saw an increasing amount of people buying apartments for cheap prices initially. Before the end of the 90s, in China, the government was giving apartments practically for free to the people living in cities. But since the population of China was well over 1 billion at that time, after 1995, a great migration of people from the countryside to the cities started occurring. This phenomenon caught the attention of the bank sector at that time. So that's why after 1998, banks started issuing cheap loans with great conditions to citizens and development loans to business owners. This is what gave strong kick to the Chinese economic growth. This not only caught the attention of the Chinese citizens, but also became a magnet for international businesses, which started pouring loads of capital into the country. I mean, knowing also that China has unregulated climate policies, taxes on business are low, and the Chinese people are cheap, disciplined workhand, who would say no to that? Before the 2000s, China was mostly agricultural and far behind many other developed countries, but now is the second biggest economy in the world. Housing also became the biggest market in China due to its huge population, which makes it heavily overexposed to real estate. Chinese real estate skyrocketed to somewhere around the early 2000s. That's when the country was at its peak in its manufacturing and economic development as well. The fast migration from the countryside brought a lot of cheap workhand to the industry, and the easy loans from the banks stimulated the buying power of the population. It was exactly those reasons, Chinese families trying to buy a house and domestic and foreign investors pouring tons of money into business and industry, and especially real estate, that created the biggest real estate bubble in history. Just to give it some perspective, in the 1990s, less than 30% of the population lived in cities, where 10 years later, that would be about 50%, and as of 2020, about 64% of the Chinese population lives in cities, which is somewhere around 900 million people. This is almost 3 times the population of the United States. So back in the 90s, people like Hu Keiyan, who's a CEO of Evergrande, which is a real estate development company, and other business owners saw an opportunity to capitalize on and took on riding the wave. Real estate company owners realized that they can pre-sell condos at cheaper prices before they even begin building. Everything was on paper only. Real estate developers would buy lands from local governments who play a key part into making the decisions of what's going to be built where. So the developers buy the land from the local governments, build dwellings and sell those dwellings to customers before they build them. Banks would provide financing to the customers. Customers have to make an advanced payments on the homes they're buying, which they do long before the construction has finished, or sometimes even before it had started. Those funds, companies like Evergrande would allocate to buy more lands and start building new homes in other areas, and then pre-sell those again in a never-ending cycle. This entire industry, the housing industry, is built on debt. Real estate companies take huge amounts of debt to start their projects. They get huge amounts of money from investors, and after that they use these as capital to get even more debt. And they used that to build even more or to pay off their previous debt. In the process, this caused many projects to be stalled, and at one moment it was too much. One of the key factors was that the rate at which population was moving from the countryside in early 2000s compared to 2020 has dropped twice, which means only one thing: the capital from customers with which companies were working has dropped exponentially over time. Yet those companies like Evergrande were building faster and were burying themselves in more and more debt, which obviously at one moment led to the failure to cover their debt. Evergrande became the most indebted company in China ever. Founded in 1997 by Hu Kaiyan, a Chinese businessman, Evergrande went from nothing to a huge real developer with about 1,000 projects in over 200 cities all over China. It was once China's top-selling property developer, but has for months been struggling under the weight of more than 300 billion of debts. On the flip side of the coin though, the investments of foreign businesses, economic reforms, and the growth of the economy gave new opportunities to people by having lifted up huge percentage of the population from poverty. In 2018, the size of Chinese middle class reached 344 million persons and comprised 25% of the total population. This compares to only 7.5 million and less than 1% of the population in 2002. Growth in China's middle class was rapid and ongoing throughout this 16-year period, and it's projected to be 800 million by 2035.
China is constantly on the move. It's estimated that in the next decade, 350 million people will leave the land for the city. It is the largest population movement in human history, and it's leading to the rise of the megacity.
As of now, CCP is trying to update the monetary policies and stimulate the creation of more job places in the city centers and in the cities in general. This would continue leading towards bringing more and more families to the urban areas. As a regular Chinese citizen, you have money to invest, but very few opportunities to do so, and most of them are risky. The stock market has seen several crashes over the past few decades, and the government randomly chooses to step in and make whatever changes they decide to. Bitcoin is illegal, and many other investment opportunities are simply not available to the average Chinese citizen. This leaves the housing market to be one of the safest options left.
So what they do is they invest in property because property prices have always gone up by more than inflation.
And they believe it'll always go up.
Yeah, just like they believed in the US.
It was big corporations willing to take the money from the people beforehand so they can boost their own capacity for constructing new houses, banks willing to lend easy money, thus creating huge piles of debt, and investors seeing prices and profits skyrocket. Those are some of the reasons for China's economy to have the biggest housing market on the planet, equaling to 30% of the country's output. Real estate in China is what fueled the fastest national economic growth on the planet, or at least it used to be until very recently. Housing is really easy way to boost economic growth through employment and spendings in the form of new homes.
How important is real estate to the Chinese economy? Is it central?
Yes, it's the main driver of growth and has been for the last few years.
All this gave the birth to China's ghost cities, developed areas with thousands of empty apartment blocks where nobody lives.
But they're not just building housing, they're building cities.
Yes, that's right.
Giant cities being built with people not coming to live here.
Yes, I think they're building somewhere between 12 and 24 new cities every single year.
Everything is here, an entire city. All the buildings, the roads, schools, hospitals, you name it. Everything that is, except the people. And looking around, there is not a soul to be seen.
They have ghost infrastructure, bridges, roads, services and utilities. All those infrastructures should be maintained while providing zero benefit to anybody. And they have been funded and built by excessive borrowing.
Why are they empty? I've heard that they have actually been sold.
They've all been sold. They've all been
All
sold.
been sold.
Absolutely.
They're owned.
Ghost cities emerged because the demand for real estate was there, but prices in the big cities and city centers, having skyrocketed, pushed families to choose more affordable and cheaper places. Developers started constructing cities from scratch super fast in a matter of few weeks. Buildings were built with pre-made construction panels and walls so they can sell more and faster.
No, I mean 700 million people in China live on less than $2 a day. They simply can't afford these. And that's why these apartments are sitting empty, because there's no one who can afford to live in them.
This is one one of the biggest and most unique modern phenomena. So many newly emerging cities scattered around China are looking like that. Another thing is, apartment prices in many Chinese cities are at higher expense rate compared to other cities around the world like New York and London, but people kept buying even when prices were so high. Around 85% of the dwellings have been sold through prepaid plans where buyers are paying mortgages on apartments and condos long before they're built, sometimes up to several years.
Workers told us that many of these buildings haven't had any work done on them for weeks, months, as if the developers just don't have the money to go on.
So that's why many of the Chinese right now who already invested and paid a good amount of the money they borrowed from the bank are going out on the streets protesting. They claim they are not going to be paying their mortgages.
Tens of thousands of them have begun withholding payments for unfinished projects across at least 50 cities in the country.
In 2020, the government introduced the so-called 3 red lines policy.
One is a liability to asset ratio of less than 70%, which is essentially a way of avoiding too many liabilities. Evergrande has over $300 billion of liabilities. The second one is a net gearing ratio of less than 100%. That's essentially a way of measuring debt compared to equity. And the third ratio is a cash to short-term debt ratio of more than 1, which just means you've got more cash than you've got short-term debt.
These are the 3 debt ratios that Chinese developers must follow to get proper access to bank loans.
Vast majority of Chinese major developers were not able to meet that requirement. They lost access to credit.
It was a pivoting moment for the business because it changed the way banks were lending money. And earlier this year, Chinese government has withheld giving loans to real estate developers whatsoever. Thus, developers have run out of money to finish the pre-sold condos, leaving millions of Chinese who invested their lifetime savings hanging.
Evergrande can't sell apartments. It also can't borrow from banks. How could it pay off the loans? And that's where the problem is.
Now, those are the people that are trying to protest against paying the mortgages they have taken from the banks. The refusal to pay bank mortgages could lead to a banking crisis likewise, and there are $350 billion of payments at risk of not getting paid. The boycott protests involved more than 300 housing projects across 90 cities. So, what does all that mean for the future economy of China? Modern economies run on business cycle. This is a rough pattern of ups and downs with a frequency of around a decade or so. This pattern is mostly caused by debt. When on average people are taking on debt, the economy goes really well, and then when on average people are paying off or defaulting on their debt, the economy slows down. Now, China is in a bust cycle and we will expect a slower economic growth, and the situation is being made much worse by CCP's adherence to the rigid zero-COVID policy. The Chinese government seems to have accepted the upcoming slower economic development anyway, referring to it as the new normal. Made in China 2025 is a plan of the government to upgrade and improve some of the key sectors of China's manufacturing in order to bring China on the same level with other superpowers worldwide. Of course, this situation will have an impact on the rest of the world as well, as many countries are dependent on the exports from China and Chinese manufacturing is dependent on imports of goods and commodities. The US could be affected the most since the volume of trade between those has increased from $5 billion in 1980 to $660 billion in 2018. On one hand, this is the third biggest export market, the largest source of imports both for the US and Europe, as well as it is the largest trading partner for the US at the moment. The collapse of China's economy would have devastating consequences for the world. On the other hand, China is highly dependent on imports of fossil fuels and other commodities to keep the manufacturing up working, and this will most likely have bad impact on the global supply of certain goods in the rest of the world. China's government has some planned strategies to stabilize the economy, including tax cuts for the small businesses and manufacturing and in other industries. The government will be issuing 29 billion in loans to support those unfinished housing projects. Just a few days ago, the new National Congress of the Communist Party was held. This congress is held every 5 years, where the top leadership of the country gets to discuss the primary questions of China at the moment. At this one they did, quote, to roughly examine the current international and domestic situation, take into account what the country requires for its development on the new journey in the new era, to formulate action plans and fundamental policies. There is much uncertainty of how the collapse of Evergrande and the property market in China will affect the global market and whether this is going to spread all over China's financial industry. But one thing is certain, China's fast-growing economy during the last couple of decades or so is a thing of the past now. The slower birth rate, the economic turmoil, the boycott protests rigid zero COVID policy, plus the enormous debt that some developers generated are drastically slowing down the real estate market and the whole Chinese economy. It's highly unlikely for the economy of China to collapse, but it is definitely suffering. Now is the perfect time for CCP to use this as an opportunity for the country to shift away from its over-dependence on real estate and focus more resources towards other sectors such as tech, tourism, science research, space exploring and technology, all of which would provide more value to the people and the nation accordingly.